Behold, my glorious supporter EyePatchNotes has requested some discussion about Buildcraft parallels. EyePatchNotes asks, may I request a discussion on the concept of parallels in Buildcraft? One of the many angles to view a game is finding player options that resemble each other. The nuance is that while the conceptual outputs can be similar, the prerequisites or conditions often differ. In Hades, we can look at a simplified relationship between Demeter and Dionysus. Demeter, chill, initially slows enemies with a later boon, decay, that deals damage over time. However, Dionysus boons initially deal damage over time, hangover, with a later boon that slows enemies, the name of which I don't remember. Two considerations here are that the slowing and damage values are actually quite different, and the fact that you might not even get the later boons. Cool. Yes, a very interesting concept. I'm really enjoying this little series of Parley questions that mostly EyePatchNotes you've been asking that kind of nail down these core concepts in different Buildcrafty games. So one of the things that is core to the build crafting experience is the desire to choose. That is like one thing that I think about a lot is that the thing that bothers me about other people's reviews of games from a build crafting perspective is it's sort of impossible, mind you, but they really don't talk about the specifics of the game's builds. They say, oh, maybe there are, by some definition, multiple builds, so there's build diversity, I guess. But, you know, what kind of buildcraft is it? Does the game's randomness immediately remove the idea for buildcraft, etc.? And we've talked about that stuff before. But what's interesting is how there are a few qualities that I think it doesn't really make sense that you would like buildcraft but not want this. And the biggest one is choice. It's what is it, you know? My dad asked me to explain what a build is basically, and I said, you know, synergy and blah 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 blah, but basically just choice, just the you choose things that you would prefer to use, right? And so parallels are really important because at the end of the day, the most simple parallel is just damage. In a game, there are many different ways you can do damage a lot of the time if it's got interesting buildcraft because it has choices. And the choice is generally, you know, maybe can I get more damage, but it's either less reliable that I'll get more damage, there are more contingencies. Maybe I need to sacrifice something else here. And then because I've, you know, taken that opportunity cost, then I unlock the ability to build into more damage. I go further down this talent tree. I equip more of this equipment set, something like that. Or maybe I can get more damage, but it's only under certain circumstances. Maybe I need 3 or more enemies to have hangover, and then I do more damage. But what if there aren't 3 enemies, or I don't have hangover on them? What if I don't even do more damage right away? I only have a slow, but then if I can get the boon that makes decay turn on, then now I have damage over time, right? And of course, Demeter's decay boon, you need to make all enemies chilled. So now it's the opposite. If there are a lot of enemies, then that's hard. If there's just the boss, that's pretty good. Hades is a really good example. And again, this is important, very important to pretty much any game that's going to have good buildcraft because the whole idea is choosing things. And for the choices to be interesting, they have to be different. If they're basically the same, then the player has a tendency to say, well, whatever, you know? Whereas if there is some meaningful difference, like maybe if you choose this animo damage percent goblet in Genshin Impact, then these abilities gain more damage than if you picked an attack percent goblet, but the attack percent goblet makes everything do more damage, not just your animo abilities. I can't think of much of a character to which that applies, but anyway, you get the point. And that's what makes those choices interesting. So yeah, this is a great example. EyePatchNotes has again included a few spoiler-covered things that I'll now click on. Regarding Hades, EyePatchNotes says, the analysis can be expanded to more than just gods. On paper, Achilles and Hades' spear cap out at the same 150% attack buff, but each has a list of incompatible hammer upgrades on top of their playstyle differences. Charon can also sell compact versions of certain late or legendary boons, if only for a limited time. Yeah, so the Charon is a really interesting example. Also, just different ways to acquire stuff. Are you okay with the thing being a consumable? Some types of players are, some types of players are really not. I'm one of those types of players a lot of the time, but it depends. Charon is an interesting example in Hades because you're talking about the Well of Charon. You can get Artemis's legendary boon for more cast gems, Or you can just buy that from a Well of Charon. It just doesn't last forever, and of course you have to actually get it, which and the final boss fight of Hades is, certainly with Extreme Measures 4, probably the hardest part of the run. And so do you need that upgrade the whole time? You know, if you had the extra cast gems from Tartarus, would you really gain much? You know what I mean? You mostly need them at the end. But you certainly gain something by having them along the way, right? Some health, maybe, death defiances that you'll save because it'll do more damage. So it's interesting. There are trade-offs like that. So this is the trip uppy for my tongue topic to talk about more, because in a way, it's such a fundament, I think, of a game's good buildcraft that it's hard to know where to go. I guess I'll first talk about what I think are kind of disinteresting parallels. These are parallels where the game is making you choose between two things that feel too similar, or the way the game is set up, there just isn't a difference. Or maybe the more important pitfall is when the player doesn't understand the significance of the difference between the two things. Now, Genshin Impact has really good examples of this. When you have attack percent and damage percent, which are just two different multipliers, you can often acquire roughly equal amounts of those two things, especially on artifact set bonuses. So a lot of players don't understand why it would, what even the point of having, 18% damage, 15%, 18% attack percent, 15% damage percent versus just getting 18% attack percent twice. If they're the same, right? If my ability does the damage percent that's appropriate, like electro damage, then what is the difference, right? Well, the difference, of course, is that the marginal benefit of one or the other is going to be higher based on which stat you have less of. And appreciating that is such an important part of pretty much every game with Buildcraft, because so often the parallel is damage in some form. And to appreciate what the differences between different kinds of damage, you need to understand marginal benefits. You can't just treat all damage as being equal, right? At the end of the day, it's all damage. You get more damage, but you get more damage if you choose this damage, and a lot of people don't understand that. Sometimes there are, an early example I gave was about this thing where sometimes you get more damage, or it's a good damage boost, but it doesn't apply to everything. And then you have the choice to opt for a less good damage boost, but it works on everything. So it's more broadly applicable, but less powerful, versus more specifically applicable, but more powerful. A lot of the time in builds, this expands the idea of, okay, these are the ways that I do damage, but this one is what I think of as the most important. So what is the trade-off when I build just for this thing to do damage versus having every way I do damage? Is there something that affects everything? Is it big enough that I'm willing to sacrifice more, but how much more damage for that one thing that I think is a more powerful source of damage? All very interesting things. And of course, another interesting aspect that's rolled in here are things that kind of come tied to your bonuses. One thing I really like about Buildcraft in games is that you very rarely have a build that is completely crisp and closes all the loose ends, and you're using everything you get. Generally, you're forced to have a few things that you don't need, they're just kind of there, and then you have the opportunity to maybe find a way for them to be really useful. My favorite example of this in Genshin Impact is Diona. We talked about the sacrificial bow versus the Favonius warbow. And for the Favonius warbow, you need to crit. But Diona doesn't need anything in her substats, so why not go for crit chance once? You have to get them or it doesn't do anything. But why not get them? Like, you have the space there. She doesn't need those for anything. And a lot of characters, I think you can do creative things with their substats. Hades is a good example as well. You oftentimes need a prerequisite boon to get a later boon, and you don't actually want the effect of the prerequisite boon. So for Demeter, for example, Demeter's Decay is a really good example because it's really powerful, and I find that I often don't want the chill. I just want Decay, but you need to get a chill boon. And so the question becomes, well, where do I put the chill boon? I have to have one. And then it's not like I can just sell the chill boon after I get Decay, because you need to chill to inflict Decay. So I can't just sell it, so I just have one. And then the onus is on you to find where could this possibly be useful. Whereas there might be a parallel that is more neat and tidy, you might say. And that can feel more or less powerful. Maybe the main thing I have to say about parallels here is actually about the pitfalls that people enter, because I complain constantly. Well, I kind of meme on it. It's not really the end of the world, but I jokingly complain for the sake of comedy and all of our enjoyment about people's addiction to saying something is the best. There hardly ever is there anything that is meaningfully the best, unless you reduce the category that we're referring to something so specific that it is just redundant to say it's the best. Like at that point, there's practically no options. So sure, it's the best in the most unexciting and unhelpful way possible. But people are really obsessed with the idea. It feels good to feel like, yeah, I concluded that this is the best decision for you, for what you want. It's not actually the best decision. You just made a good reasoned decision. I get it. I like that. It feels fun. But it's not like objectively the best. It's just a good idea, right? And I think that where these things come from is that people look at the parallel between the two things, and they either see what they're looking for, or they find a reason why they would prefer it a certain way, and they either look past the other benefits or they don't know what the other benefits are. And a lot of the time, most of the time, in interesting buildcrafty games, there is kind of some trade-off, and you really get into problems where there isn't, because it feels really bad if you think, well, it's not like I'm excited to go build this thing on this character. I just need to. There's no choice. I just have to go get it. The character feels kind of incomplete. I even have this experience sometimes in a way maybe other people don't, where I'm using a character, maybe in Genshin Impact, and I'm trying to pick a weapon for them, but I don't have any weapons that are really a good choice. And so I have to choose, but they're all bad choices. Some of them are less bad, sure, but it feels bad because I know what I want, I just don't have it. And I think that a thing games can do well is if they're going to offer options. Parallels are good because they mean options. It means that you're choosing between two things. Having only one option in that category is bad, and having none is, to me, kind of even worse, because it means you just have to... It's like a negative choice. You do have to make a choice, but it's about something you don't care about, which is psychologically very exhausting. And making the player relax when they play a buildcrafty game is maybe largely about making sure that they're making choices they care about, that they're invested in, rather than choices they're simply required to make a choice all the time, you know? And that would be overwhelming. An interesting, simple example would be in something like Genshin Impact when you have artifact substats. Imagine if you could pick artifact substats. First of all, this would be super OP. But second of all, think about it a little bit. A lot of the time, you kind of wouldn't know what to put as the fourth stat, or the third stat would usually be pretty easy. But a lot of the time, you might think, I guess this, you know, or it would feel kind of rote. You would just pick the same thing a lot of the time. And there's a way in which the game kind of frees you from that choice. There is a way in which people like randomness because they're freed a little bit from having to choose the thing. So I think that's kind of interesting. Again, one of the things about parallels in Hades is that because you don't manually choose every boon you get, there's a way in which the game is giving you a little bit of amnesty over, you know, you don't actually have to choose every single boon you get. We're just going to give you some. When you get exhausted of choosing, you just pick one. Like, here they are, these are in front of you, you know? And the interesting decisions in Hades come from, do I want to take the chance on this other thing or just settle for what I have? Okay, EyePatchNotes has left another spoilered out part. Sorry, I was reading while I was explaining what was happening. Nestled in this conversation, EyePatchNotes says, is what to do with an effect that is not paralleled in a game. It takes a critical eye to identify the merits of a unique effect and whether that effect can benefit from a system not specifically built around it. That is to say, maybe real buildcraft is finding out if the unique effect is meme-worthy. Interesting. Yeah, so there is one aspect of making a build where you say, these are the options on the table. My ultimate goal is blank. Here are a couple different ways to get there. Good buildcraft involves looking at those options and understanding the merits and detriments of each option and deciding which one you would prefer, and resisting the immature temptation to declare that one of them is just better, and to just decide and say, this was my choice. I'm not objectively right. I can make a decision without being objectively right. I might have a little bit of a bone to pick with people that say this thing, which of course none of you do, which brings my heart great joy. But I agree, EyePatchNotes, there's kind of another thing where a lot of the time the game will present a unique effect to you, and it's usually pretty specific, and you think, rather than do I want to get that effect this way or this other way, there's a way in which you can think of it as, is this effect even a thing that you want, you know? So again, Genshin Impact continues to be a wellspring of examples, but Hades has a lot too. There's the idea of, you know, in Hades, you might have a boon that gives you more cast gems or increased cast gem recharge time. And you might think, okay, well, this is pretty much the only way I can get this, or it's the only way I'm going to get this. The cast gem recharge time, that's pretty unique. And you think, well, do I care about this? Does it gain me much? If I'm going to use my cast over and over, it's not for utility, it's going to be for damage. Then I guess it increases my damage. Do I want to be doing something else during that time? But that's a kind of simple one. Really, I think where the good examples for this come from are in effects like Genshin Impact 4-piece sets, like Thundering Fury. The 4-piece set says when you do an electro-elemental reaction, you reduce the cooldown of your elemental skill by 1 second, up to once every second or so. Meaning that if you do reactions constantly, you have the cooldown of your elemental skill all the time, which is obviously very good if you could do that all the time. But there isn't really an easy way to parallel the benefit of that effect. It makes you start to wonder, what type of abilities would this be good for? Are there characters that have abilities that fit this well? Can those characters consistently proc an electro-related elemental reaction? Can they do it without their elemental skill? Because you need to be able to do it while your elemental skill is cooling down to get a benefit from it. Could it possibly be good on characters other than electro characters? I know EyePatchNotes has tried that. Stuff like that. The thing that I think is interesting here is that a lot of the time, the way to think about those effects is using parallels, is to think, okay, well, this cooldown reduction thing is largely unique. There is one other, but we're not going to talk about gamblers set in Genshin Impact. But you think about this cooldown reduction thing and you think, okay, well, it's basically damage. I'm basically getting damage. I get to use my skill more often, some utility maybe, but let's just say damage. How much more damage would I need for it to be worth that amount of cooldown reduction? So in the case of this Thundering Fury set, you're getting 50% cooldown reduction on your elemental skill. So you're doing 50% more damage with your elemental skill. And that's a separate multiplier as well. So is there a way that you could spend that build space that you're getting that cooldown reduction effect? Could you spend that build slot and get 50% of a separate multiplier? No, definitely not. In Genshin Impact anyway, not even close. Like, no, you can't. And so the question is it worth sacrificing, you know, some other utility or flexibility in your team to make enough elemental reactions happen to get that 50% damage? Because you lose damage there too, right? And there you can sort of think about it in terms of parallels. And again, I think this is where the people that struggle with the simple parallels, like I want a bow for Diona that gives me particles back, which one should I pick? And they don't really see why they're never gonna be better or worse than each other. They're just different. It's those people struggling with that really don't understand at all this concept that you can transform these unique abilities into parallels as well, and then evaluate them that way. Of course, you can't always. Sometimes you have these effects that you just can't math out. It brings me great joy when I'm looking through basically any build video or a build discussion, and you see the point at which the person gets to an effect where you cannot put this on a spreadsheet. I mean, you can choose arbitrarily what the effect is going to give you. You can, you know, make it into a number and then put it on the spreadsheet, but you don't. There's no way to know. You have to just guess, basically. And I think that's the point that a lot of games become truly interesting for Buildcraft, because they get to a point where it is just not possible to say which one, even if they were numerically superior to one another, the way that they work is just different. And even the people that want to run the numbers, that want a single answer, become forced to admit, if they're being honest with themselves, that there simply is not a better choice. You just have to decide the one you like more. There is not a better choice. And people are going to say, why did you pick this one? And you're going to have to just tell them why you like it. You're not going to be able to say, well, it's better because da 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 da. And it's like, well, no, it isn't. It's just different. And I think those effects are really fun. I love effects like that. I think this is why it's bad to have lots of mods in Warframe, for example, that are just stats rather than abilities, because it makes the game more of a more of a mandatory mod simulator. The less of those effects you have, the better. Having things like in Hades, where you have the damage based boons, or the percent damage based boons, the boons that do a set amount of damage per hit, and the boons that give you a percent of the damage you were doing each hit. It's simple in the sense that some weapons, clearly, you hit many times for very low damage. On the Rama bow special and on the gun attack, you hit many times for very low damage. So it's obviously more damage, all other factors notwithstanding, to go with, say, Zeus attack, rather than a percent-based attack like Aphrodite's attack. But of course, there are benefits to having weak on the enemy, and applying it quickly. There's Aphrodite's legendary, but also a bunch of duo boons, you know. And on the other hand, there are things like the gun special, and to a lesser degree, I would say the Arthur sword, that do so much damage in their attacks, but hit so slowly that it's obviously superior, all factors notwithstanding, to go for the percent-based damage increases rather than the flat ones. But then most of the weapons in the game, in Hades, are not like that. Most swords, the spear, the other weapons, it's just not so clear. I mean, you can do the math, but at the end of the day, they're close. If you can do the math, and you'll find out that they're close. There's not clearly one that's better than the other. They're close enough that it depends what else you're going to use in your build. Yes, maybe the Zeus Lightning is a little behind on the spear compared to going for crits, but if you get jolted, then it's a whole different story. If you get more crit boons, then it's a whole different story. You know, it just goes like that. And I think that what's interesting is that the idea of having this elegant, crisp buildcraft experience where things are not overly complicated is kind of at odds with, you know, the struggle is that it's at odds with this idea of making sure there isn't a single best choice so that you can really make a decision and choose a thing that you'd like. Pick a grave to lie in, as it were, and that's the challenge. You have to find a way to make a system where the choices are just different. They can't be better or worse, they're just different. And yet the game is not super convoluted to the point where the game is not so complicated that it just bullies you out of knowing which choice is the best. There has to legitimately not be a best choice. And I think it's interesting when these games get played to death, you know, when they get really popular and people get really into them and analyze them a lot, to see what those people settle on. And I think a lot of the time, kind of an ongoing question for me as somebody who does this and talks about this thing for a career, is whether or not people don't just give up at the end of the day, you know? You think of high-level speed runs, or an example that I think of, where a lot of the time at very high-level speed running, you still see people running different routes, and you think, surely one of them is just better. Like, one of the routes is just better, right? But even then, you often see that people will choose a different route because there's an element of randomness on one of them, or it's riskier. You know, this one is faster, but if you fail, the run is basically over, whereas this other one, it might be a little slower, but you're probably not going to mess up this one part, and even if you do, it's actually not that bad, you know, something like that. And you see that all the time, and speedrunning is not directly related, but just to make the point that when people heavily analyze something, you'd kind of expect that they get to a point where there's just the best one. There's no way there isn't ultimately a best one. And now they might not even say, well, this one is the best in every way, but they would say, okay, but on balance, I say this all the time, this is a good general recommendation. And I think a lot of the time, even that is untrue. Even that doesn't exist. A lot of the time you go deep into a game that's really well designed and you find at the end, I don't know. I just have to tell you the options because there really isn't one that is a straightforwardly good single recommendation where I won't regret not telling you about the other one, you know? Maybe that says more about me and my obsession with giving people options, but I'm not so sure. I think lots of people, smart people other than me, seem to agree that it can be difficult to make a single decision. I think that's most of what I have to say about it. But this whole parallels concept is really interesting. Parallels is a good word for it too. But it's interesting what you said about the maybe real buildcraft is finding out if the unique effect is meme worthy. It's funny because I actually think a lot of the time those are the more mathy aspects. There's only one source of the effect, and you can find a way to translate it into what does this represent, and then kind of go from there. I think that's the tricky bit. something kind of related to this to me is a lot of the time when you have parallels or unique effects, you make the choice pretty frequently in nuanced, interesting buildcrafty games. You frequently make the choice between the two or whatever options based on which one is more practical. Even if you're not interested in that, there will come a point where you will make the decision at least partially based on practicality. Let me explain what I mean. So there will be times when you think, okay, well, this effect is obviously very good in a certain situation, but does that situation come up often enough that I'm willing to go for it? Or, is this build that has higher upside, is the upside going to come up often enough that I'm willing to not go with this more versatile build? And you might be saying, well, that's similar. But a lot of the time or some of the time, you find yourself in a situation where the two, this is hard to explain, I'm sorry, you can see that I'm struggling. You have an option where you can think of a good reason why you would prefer this option and a good reason why you prefer that option, but they're both so niche and the ability to build for both of them is so inaccessible at a certain point. You can't just make every choice, in Hades, you literally can't make every choice. I mean, you could do another run and make a different choice, right? But in a lot of games, in Genshin Impact, you could get many artifact sets and make like every choice and swap between them. But there comes a point at which this is just impractical. And even the people that are very interested in that will stop and say, okay, at this point, it's funny because sometimes I say things like my Bennett in Genshin Impact has kind of an all-rounder build, and a lot of people find that a little odd because Bennett has such high potential with his attack buff. Why not just sacrifice any other benefit from your weapon and get the weapon with the highest attack buff, the highest attack value, base attack value? And my reasoning is simply that you can gain so much more from him, and he gives you such a significant effect, even with a less whatever weapon, that it feels to me like a waste of I'm not going to make multiple builds just to get a little more benefit. I'm not willing to put in that amount of work for that relatively small benefit, right? And a lot of people feel uncomfortable with that because they feel like it's wasting the character's potential. But what's interesting is that if you go far enough, everybody agrees with this mindset. It's just a matter of degree, which is fine. I'm not trying to say that people are silly for disagreeing with me. I just think it's interesting to see. To me, it's much less about, oh, you're just the kind of person where you don't want to make compromises. No, everyone compromises. You're forced to. The question is when? How far do you wait, essentially? How many sets of gear are you willing to make? And it's interesting to see the kind of player that I never am, where they have one character. Warframe, this is common. You hear about the people that own multiple of a Warframe, even its prime variant, so they can fit more builds on the different Warframes, or like more mod, polarity customization, more forma customizations, more different builds that require different forma. I don't know what word I'm trying to say. And I build every single Warframe in the game, and I have never ever needed to do that. So to me, it's like it's not like it's never been. I get why people would need to. It's not like that never comes up at all to me, but I'm always able to figure it out. Maybe it takes like one more forma, but it would never have saved me time to just get another one of the Warframe, And so when I hear people say this, like they have 3 Nyxes that they have different builds on or something, I think, how on earth could you do the thing? And yet I sort of understand this is a person who wants the builds that are only a little bit different from each other, but technically there are situations where this one is a bit better, and their threshold for when they're willing to compromise and kind of give up on having every single thing and having it all, that point for them is much further than mine. I'm willing to compromise a lot sooner, mostly because I'm obsessed with this idea of having good general advice and being able to help the most people have the most fun by giving advice that is applicable to a lot of people, where I say, here are the 2 options. Neither of them is just better. But if you're having trouble choosing, then I recommend this one, and this is why. And then if you're the kind of person that's going to choose the other option, you'll hear me say that and think, oh no, screw that guy. I'm using this other one. Fine. Like, I've done my job then, But to me, I'm okay with settling for one. I can live with the lost possibility of me having the other one, and a lot of people can't, which I kind of respect. I really like the idea of just building every single thing. I just think there isn't enough time in the world. So I don't know. It's only tangentially related to parallels, but I think one of the interesting things about people who like build craft is the degree to which they understand parallels and the degree to which they embrace parallels. There are people like me who love when they're being forced to not have it all, and there are people who love when a game doesn't let them have it all, but then you actually can, you just have to make multiple builds. And there are people who don't understand why they can't have it all, it's because diverse options are good. And there are people who are kind of scared of figuring out what gets them what they want, and that's all really interesting. And I feel like there are games that do to varying degrees different jobs of addressing that effectively or not, which is what I think is so interesting about this. I really thought this one was interesting. I thought I had nothing else to say like halfway through this one, but indeed I actually have much, probably surprising no one. I had much more to say. Cool. Wow. Thanks for asking. I'm really enjoying this little series. Now, future looking Zandy here, iPatch, I noticed that after I made the video about the alignment chart for parlay requests, and I called you lawful good for asking these parlay that are just the exact thing that I've been working on personally. I noticed that your next parlay request is not like this. You've asked quite a few almost in a row that have been in this format. May I ask request a discussion about buildcraft topic? And now the next one is very different. So I see what you're doing. You're trying to rebrand over there. I'm looking forward to it. I hope everybody else is too.